The muscular system. We will have an emphasis in this lecture. We'll talk mostly about skeletal muscle um, in the sense that we'll discuss how it is attached to surrounding structures, tendons, bones, things like that. Um, and we'll then look at the physiology of a muscle contraction. So we take one muscle cell and we'll zoom in on it and we will look at the microscopic structure of it, what is its functional unit, and how exactly it contracts itself to produce gross body movement and large scale movement that we see all around us and that we perform every day. So we'll start off, we'll talk about some functions of muscle tissue. Now different muscle tissues will perform some of these different functions in different ways depending on what type of muscle tissue we're talking about. But in general, all muscle tissue results in some type of movement, right? So in a little bit, we'll talk about the three different types of muscle tissue being skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle tissue. And if you think about these and once you learn about them, they all have something to do with movement. They move something in some way. So breathing, we're moving, we're contracting the diaphragm. We are contracting this muscle to go downward to increase the size of our thoracic cavity, and we bring air in or we move it in. Circulation, we're moving blood. So in the heart, when the heart itself contracts, it is pumping blood. We have smooth muscle lining blood vessels, and when some of these contract, they can constrict the vessel or make it larger and dilate it. So this can result in the movement and circulation of blood. We also have smooth muscle in our digestive tract, surrounding different digestive system organs, stomach, small and large intestine, things like this. And when this smooth muscle contracts, it can produce peristaltic contractions that will move along digested material throughout our small and large intestine. And then processes like urination. When urine is flowing, when it is moving, we can control this by a couple of different muscles. We'll see we have an internal and an external urethral sphincter, one being under autonomic control, the internal urethral sphincter, and then one being under somatic control or control that we have the ability to regulate, that being the external urethral sphincter. So those are all different examples of movement. We have stability, and so lots of muscles in our back produce our posture and help to keep us aligned. We know that we have lots of other muscles throughout our body that regulate our posture and how we are stable in space. We have muscles of facial expression. We have muscles around our face and around our mouth that aid in speech. We have muscles that are known as sphincters that are round circular muscles that control openings. We have an internal and external anal sphincter. We've already talked about the internal and external urethral sphincter. And then we can also have muscles function in heat production. So when we shiver, we have very rapid contraction and relaxation of skeletal muscle whenever we shiver that can produce heat. And then we can also break down ATP in this sense as well, and we have heat as a byproduct of that. So here we can see different muscles throughout the body. We have the diaphragm here to the left, this kind of dome-shaped muscle. You see it's really in two parts with a central tendon connecting in between. You have muscles along your back. These are referred to as your intrinsic back muscles that result in posture. You can see some attached way down here near the ilium and sacrum. You have ones attaching along the ribs and ones attaching up here at the base of your skull near your occipital bone. And then around your face you see lots of structures. You have muscles surrounding your eye and your mouth. You have ones here that aid in chewing, so muscles of mastication is what they're referred to as. And you have these other muscles that aid in different facial expressions, speech production. And so these are all very important muscles. Lots of these are very small. In cadaver dissection, it can be very difficult to isolate and find some of these muscles sometimes just because they are very thin. And so a very delicate touch and very careful dissection is required to isolate these different muscles of facial expression and muscles of mastication. So we've already alluded to the three types of muscle. We know there are skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. They each differ in roughly their appearance, as well as what they're composed of and how they or what they act on. So we know that our skeletal muscle, this is going to act on our bones via a tendon to produce movement. So whenever our muscles contract, they'll pull on the tendon. The tendon is attached to the periosteum surrounding the bone, and this will pull on the bone and produce movement. So you can do this with your bicep. If you have your right arm straight out in front of you, and you contract your bicep, you notice that you are flexing your arm at the elbow. And so this is one way to produce body movement with skeletal muscle. It is striated and it is voluntary. Voluntary meaning that we have conscious control over this muscle, so you can think and you can consciously control whether or not your biceps brachii muscle contracts, right? There's lots of other muscles that are voluntary, all of our skeletal muscle. And then it is striated, and we'll look at what striated means and what striations mean. But for now, we'll just define it as these fibers, these lines that you see and that are apparent in muscle whenever you look at them histologically. Whenever you look at them under the microscope, you see these little lines, these striations. And later on, when we talk about the physiology of a muscle contraction, we'll go back to those small little filaments, those little fibers, and see exactly what they're doing. Our cardiac muscle is our second type of muscle tissue. It is responsible for the contraction of the heart. This is the myocardium of the heart. You have the epicardium, myocardium, and endocardium. The myocardium here is the actual contractile layer of the heart. It is striated just as our skeletal muscle is, but it is involuntary, meaning that we do not have conscious control over this heart muscle tissue. We know that when this heart muscle tissue does contract, whether you're talking about the atria or the ventricles of the heart, when they contract, it will move and produce movement of blood, either within the heart or up and out of the heart toward our lungs or toward the rest of our body. And then our smooth muscle is our third type that we'll discuss. It lines different hollow organs, things like our stomach, our small and large intestine that we've alluded to. We also find it in our blood vessels, in the middle layer of our blood vessels called the tunica media. It is largely composed of smooth muscle tissue. We'll see that smooth muscle tissue is involuntary, just like cardiac, meaning we do not have control over it. But whereas skeletal and cardiac are striated, smooth muscle is going to be non-striated. So it still has the same filaments that you find in skeletal and cardiac muscle, but they are arranged differently. And so because of this different arrangement, you do not get the striations, these lines that you see running across skeletal and cardiac muscle cells. So they still have the same filaments, the same little proteins and fibers, but it's arranged differently so as to not make the striated appearance. So here's just a basic kind of picture and schematic and where you can find these. And so we have smooth cardiac and muscle. Smooth that we just saw here. You can, if you look closely at the appearance of the cell, it looks very smooth, hence its name, compared to cardiac and skeletal muscles where you see these little fibers running perpendicularly across this cell. We know that we find this in internal organs and it is involuntary. For our cardiac muscle cells, and these smooth muscle cells are generally mononucleated. They just have a single kind of elongated nucleus in the middle. Our cardiac muscle cells also generally just have a single nucleus. You can see that they kind of form this branching network, kind of form these X-shaped patterns. They are striated. We find this in the heart, and it is also involuntary. One thing to note about cardiac muscle tissue, as you can see on this histological picture, these dark lines kind of going across, and if you look closely on these images down here, you can see these little lines, kind of jagged lines running across, joining two cells together. These are called intercalated discs, and these intercalated discs serve as a connection between adjacent cardiac myocytes that allow them to communicate with each other, and this is very important when you talk about the cardiac muscle contraction. You want the impulse to flow from one cell to the next cell very rapidly, so the whole heart, the whole tissue itself contracts as a single unit, as opposed to different contractions at different times. And so these intercalated discs are very important, and they're unique to only cardiac muscle tissue. And then we have skeletal muscle tissue over here. We see that we have striations, again, just as we see in cardiac muscle tissue, these striations. Skeletal muscle is generally multinucleated, so you can see various nuclei in this image, and you can see ones down here in this schematic as well. Sometimes skeletal muscle is also referred to skeletal muscle fibers. The cells are referred to as fibers because they have a fibrous appearance to them. And you can kind of see these elongated, fibrous appearing strands here, these cells. And we know that these are voluntary. We have conscious control over the contraction of the skeletal muscle. Okay, so we'll look at the skeletal muscle. We said that the focus is going to be on skeletal muscle. So from here on out through the different parts and the different lectures, focus on the skeletal muscle. Picture a single fiber, and that's what we'll use as our reference. So we have already said that sometimes the cells are also referred to as fibers. And the grouping of skeletal muscle is, when you talk about the nervous system, it's grouped very similar to how nerves are grouped. So they're grouped into these bundles or these different fascicles kind of all grouped together. And so we'll take a look at one, but for now we'll just define these different terms. We have the epimysium or epimysium, we have the perimysium, and the endomysium. Now from superficial to deep, it is in this order: epimysium, perimysium, endomysium, and you can see what they're surrounding. So around our whole cell, we have an epimysium layer. Around individual groups or fascicles of cells or fibers, we have the perimysium, and then endo around an individual fiber. You can remember these. Generally, if you look at the prefix, epi kind of means around or on top. Epi means on top. Peri refers to something being around or surrounding a group of muscle fibers. And then endo refers to the innermost or deepest most layer that surrounds individual fibers. So if we take a look here, we look at our epimysium here. It surrounds the entire muscle. So this large outermost circle here is the entire muscle. So there's the epimysium. A perimysium you can see here surrounding this fascicle, and so you can see many fascicles all around. So here's your perimysium, and then the perimysium would be surrounding this entire fascicle. And then if we look around an individual muscle fiber, so we pull this out, you can see endomysium here. So this black line indicating or pointing to this kind of lighter color here around this muscle fiber, this is the endomysium. Okay, so epi, peri, endomysium. And then whenever we pull out a single muscle fiber, as we've done here, we'll have even smaller things called myofibrils. And within this myofibril, we'll see myofilaments. You may even be able to see these little lines on this myofibril. We'll take a closer look at this whenever we look at the structure of myofibrils and how they act to help our muscles contract. So we will now talk about a little organization of skeletal muscle and kind of how it is associated with other surrounding structures. So we have things like tendons, aponeuroses, deep fascia, superficial fascia. We'll start with tendon. A tendon, I think we're all pretty familiar with tendon. It is a connective tissue. It's a dense, regular connective tissue that is connecting a muscle to the bone via the periosteum of the bone. And so you can feel tendons. Probably the most common and well-known tendon is on the back of your leg, down near your heel. This is your calcaneal tendon, sometimes referred to as your Achilles tendon. We have something called an aponeurosis. An aponeurosis is a broad sheet of connective tissue that's generally attaching two or more muscles. And so we have, and I'll show a picture, I believe, in a second, but we have one called the epicranial aponeurosis running on top of the head. And then we have a couple of layers of tissue called fascia. We have a deep fascia and a superficial fascia. Deep fascia is going to be deeper than our superficial, hence its name. This will separate adjacent muscles, and it will contain lots of different neurovascular structures, and I'll show you an image that will make this a little easier to understand. And then we have a superficial fascia, or the subcutaneous layer, which is primarily fat, so adipose tissue and loose connective tissue. And it's right below our skin, so it's right on top the muscle. So if we take a look here, you can see this image on the left here. This is indicating an aponeurosis, so it's connecting this muscle belly to this muscle belly, and this is the epicranial aponeurosis here. And then here we can see this is a transection through the forearm. And so you can see radius and ulna here. You can see posterior and anterior forearm muscle groups. And what you can see here, indicated by this arrow, is this deep fascia separating adjacent muscles. So here's a muscle group, and it's divided and separated by this deep fascia, or this deep investing fascia with veins, arteries, and nerves here. If you look further out, you can see this outer layer of fat tissue. This is your superficial fascia. So superficial because it is closer to the surface. And you can see it's primarily yellow in color, and this yellow in color is representing the adipose tissue that you find here. And then just superficial to that, you can see the skin right out here. So we will stop there, and we'll pick up with part 2 talking about the microscopic structure of our skeletal muscle.